The bus groaned to a stop at the edge of the training compound, its brakes releasing a hiss of air that hung in the cold morning. One by one, the recruits spilled out onto the gravel, lugging duffel bags, stretching their legs, their voices rising. In a chaotic mix of laughter, curses, and nervous chatter. They were young, some barely out of high school, others with faces hardened by a few more years of life. But all of them carried the same restless energy, like hounds straining at the leash. She stepped out quietly, the last to leave the bus. Her boots landed softly on the gravel, so soft that the crunch was almost swallowed by the noise of the others. She stood there for a moment, taking in the vast spread of the base. The parade ground stretched wide before her, flanked by low buildings and the towering flagpole that caught the morning wind. The flag snapped sharply in the breeze, its sound, crisp, commanding attention even in the chaos. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and walked forward, her steps measured, her gaze steady. There was nothing dramatic about her entrance, no loud words, no swagger, no glance around to claim her place. She moved as though she had always belonged there, though to the others, she looked like anything but. The other recruits noticed. Her, of course. In a place where bravado was currency, someone so quiet stood out like a shadow among flames. A tall boy with a shaved head elbowed his friend and jerked his chin toward her. "Look at that one," he muttered. "Doesn't look like she's here to train. Looks like she's here to read books or something." His friend smirked. "Yeah, she won't last a week." The comments didn't reach her ears directly, but she felt them. She always did. The laughter, the sideways glances, it was nothing new. She had worn those looks all her life, like invisible weights pressing against her shoulders. Some people broke under them. She had learned to carry them in silence. The drill sergeant arrived like a thunderclap, his voice cutting through the chatter before his. Footsteps even reached the group. Line up now. You think this is a summer camp? You think you're on vacation? Move." The recruits scrambled into formation, fumbling with bags, shoving shoulders to find space. She moved with the same calm efficiency as before, slipping into line without a word, her posture straight, her eyes forward. The sergeant paced in front of them, his gaze sharp, his presence heavy as iron. He scanned the line, his boots striking the ground with each deliberate step. He stopped briefly in front of her. His eyes lingered a second longer than they had on the others. Something in her face, her stillness, seemed to make him curious, but he said nothing. He moved on, barking at another recruit whose shirt wasn't tucked, his voice cracking across the line like a whip. Around her, the noise continued. The recruits shifted, whispered, smirked at one another behind stiffened faces. Already, little groups had begun to form, those who shared jokes, those who boasted about sports, those who bragged about how many pull-ups they could do. She stood apart, though she was right among them, a shadow in the ranks. The first day unfolded in a blur of shouted orders, hurried meals, and physical drills designed to grind the recruits down to their rawest selves. Sweat slicked the air, muscles burned, lungs heaved. The louder ones competed openly, flexing their strength, racing to finish first, shouting over one another with wild energy. She moved at her own pace, not slow, not lazy, but steady, methodical, like a machine calibrated for endurance rather than show. But in a place where noise was mistaken for power, her silence was misread. During a water break, a recruit leaned against the fence and nodded toward her. "She doesn't talk. Bet she's scared." Another snorted. "Scared? Nah, just weak. You can tell. She won't keep up when it gets tough." The words floated easily among them, wrapped in laughter. It didn't matter to them that she was finishing every drill. It didn't matter that she was holding her own without complaint. To them, silence meant weakness. To them, quiet meant she didn't belong. That night, in the barracks, the atmosphere shifted from strained discipline to restless release. Boots clattered, conversations rose, and laughter filled the long room. She sat on her bunk, her back straight, her duffel neatly stowed, her hands folded in her lap. Around her, others bragged about the day, exaggerated their own performance, retold stories of glory before training. She said nothing. A boy across the aisle caught her eye and smirked. "Hey, quiet girl," he said loud enough for others to hear. "You gonna talk at all, or just sit there staring at walls?" A ripple of chuckles spread through the room. She looked at him for a long second, then returned her gaze to her folded hands. She did not answer. A silence stung them more than words would have. It left them unsettled, frustrated, like fists swinging through empty air. But they disguised the unease with more laughter, more jokes. In the quiet hours after lights out, when the barracks had gone still, she lay awake staring at the ceiling. The doubts, the smirks, the careless cruelty of strangers. It was nothing she hadn't faced before. And just like before, she let it pass over her like water against stone. She had not come to training to win their approval. She had not come to trade jokes or outshout anyone. She had come for the challenge, for the discipline, for the test of herself. And deep inside, she knew something they did not. She knew there was more to strength than noise, more to courage than a smirk, more to belonging than the approval of those around her. Her chance would come. And when it did, she would not need words. She would need only a single sound, the crack of a bullet through the morning air, to silence them all. Morning reveille shattered the stillness before dawn, a piercing bugle call that dragged the recruits from their bunks. Groans, curses, and hurried footsteps filled the barracks. The floor rattled as dozens of boots hit the ground at once. She was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bunk, lacing her boots with precise, unhurried motions. The others moved frantically, stuffing gear into bags, fumbling with uniforms, jostling one another to get ready before the drill sergeant stormed in. She moved with steady rhythm, every fold of fabric neat, every strap pulled tight. There was no panic in her only quiet readiness. When the sergeant burst through the door with his voice like thunder, he found her standing straight by her bunk, her bed made tight enough to bounce a coin. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing at the chaos, then pausing briefly on her. His gaze flicked over her, registering the perfection of her bunk and uniform. But instead of praise, he barked at the rest of the room, dragging them into line with words that burned like fire. As they marched out into the gray morning, the air was already thick with murmurs. "She's too calm," one recruit whispered. To another, "It's like she's not even human, just standing there like a statue." "Or maybe she's scared stiff," came the reply. "Doesn't say anything, doesn't smile, doesn't complain. She's hiding it. Watch first real test, she'll break." The whispers gained traction as the days wore on. Every moment of her silence became another reason for them to doubt her. At chow, while others laughed and traded stories, she ate quietly, eyes on her tray. At the obstacle course, while others shouted encouragement or curses, she moved through the challenges. With steady focus, her lips pressed in a firm line. To them, it looked wrong. "Normal people talk," a tall recruit muttered one afternoon, watching her run drills without a word. "She doesn't. That's not strength, that's weakness." She's got nothing to say. But the drill instructors noticed too. They didn't mock her, not openly. They watched instead. During endurance runs, one sergeant timed her stride, noticing how she never fell behind, never slowed. During weapons drills, another instructor glanced at the way her hands handled equipment, firm, practiced, calm. They did not say anything. but their eyes lingered, curious. Her fellow recruits didn't see the instructor's interest. All they saw was her silence, and to them, silence was suspicious. One evening, as the recruits scrubbed down the barracks, a small group gathered near the bunks, their whispers sharper than before. "She doesn't belong here," said one. "You can tell she's not built for this. She's fragile." "Fragile?" Another laughed. "She's like a ghost. You ever hear her laugh? You ever hear her talk? It's creepy." The words carried across the room, deliberately loud enough for her to hear. She paused in her work, wringing out a rag, her hands steady. For a moment, her eyes flicked up calm, unreadable. She didn't answer, didn't challenge. She bent her head back down and kept cleaning. That only fueled them further. She's weak. That's why she doesn't fight back. They didn't understand that she didn't need to. The doubts followed her like shadows. At meals, they sat in clusters, while she ate alone. On the track, they paired up for runs, leaving her with no partner. In the barracks, conversations fell into laughter that left her on the outside. But if she felt the sting, she never showed it. She never fidgeted under their stares, never flushed at their words. She moved with the same quiet focus, as if the world around her didn't matter. It unsettled some of them. A recruit named Miller grew especially restless around her. He was loud, quick with jokes, always eager to prove himself. But when his jokes about her fell flat, when she didn't rise to his bait, his frustration deepened. One night, as they cleaned rifles after drills, Miller leaned across the table. "Hey, quiet girl," he said, his tone mocking. "You know how to use that thing? Or you just polishing it for fun?" A couple of the others snickered, watching. She looked up, met his gaze for a second, then went back to her task. She said nothing. The silence burned hotter than any comeback could have. Miller's smirk faltered, then returned, wider, forced. "See? Told you. Nothing to say she's a ghost." The others laughed, but uneasily. The doubts spread beyond the recruits. Even some of the instructors, hardened by years of training young soldiers, couldn't quite place her. During performance reviews, they noted her efficiency, her endurance, her precision. But they also noted her lack of voice. "She's holding back," one instructor said during a staff meeting. "Not weakness, exactly. Something else. Like, she's waiting." Another frowned. "Waiting for what?" The first shrugged. "Don't know, but I'd keep an eye on her." Days turned to weeks. The training intensified. Fatigue wore on the recruits like sandpaper, stripping away the outer layers until their raw selves were exposed. The loud ones grew louder, desperate to prove their strength. The weaker ones stumbled, breaking under pressure. And she remained steady. The more she endured, the more their doubts deepened. She was too calm, too consistent, too silent. To them, it wasn't natural. "She's hiding something," Miller whispered one night as they lay in their bunks. "Nobody's that quiet unless they're afraid." But fear didn't live in her silence. Something else did. Something none of them could see yet. One night, after lights out, a storm rolled across the sky, thunder rattling the barracks. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating rows of faces in brief bursts of white. She lay awake, listening to the storm, her breath even, her mind sharp. Around her, the whispers had died. The laughter, the jokes, the doubts, they were muffled now, drowned by rain and thunder. For the first time in weeks, there was quiet. And in that quiet, she felt her strength. It wasn't in words. It wasn't in laughter or bravado. It was in patience, in silence, in the calm before the moment she knew was coming. The doubts didn't weaken her. They sharpened her. Each one was a reminder of what she had yet to reveal. And when the time came, their doubts would shatter like glass against stone. Her silence was not weakness. It was the waiting edge of a blade. The sun beat down on the training field, turning the gravel into shimmering waves of heat. Sweat stung the eyes of the recruits as they dropped into push-up position, their palms grinding against the grit. The drill sergeant's voice thundered over them, demanding more, always more. Down, up, down, up. Groans echoed across the line. Muscles trembled, breaths came ragged, faces turned red. Some recruits shouted encouragement to themselves or to the others, voices cracking with exhaustion. She moved in silence, lowering herself with steady rhythm, pressing back up without a sound. Her breathing was controlled, even to anyone watching. Closely, her form was flawless. But the recruits weren't watching for perfection. They were watching for weakness. "Look at her," Miller muttered between gasps, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Doesn't even grunt. Bet she's barely pushing at all." A couple of others snickered. One tilted his head toward her, his face twisted. In mock concern, "Careful, quiet girl. Don't want to break a sweat?" She didn't answer. She didn't look at them. She pressed on, rep after rep, her pace unbroken. The sergeant bellowed again. "Hold it down position." Groans surged. To the ranks. Backs quivered, elbows buckled. A few collapsed to the ground, chests heaving. She stayed locked in place, her body held firm, eyes fixed on the dirt beneath her. Miller's arms shook violently. His teeth clenched as he strained to hold himself up. He glanced sideways, saw her steady as stone, and his lips curled into a smirk meant to mask his struggle. "She's too light," he muttered through gritted teeth. "That's why it's easy for her." Another nearby recruit chuckled weakly. "Yeah, probably the only reason she's still up." Their smirks weren't born of confidence. They were shields, desperate attempts to cover the truth they didn't want to admit, that she was stronger in silence than they were in noise. The morning continued with sprints across the scorching track. Recruits exploded forward at the sergeants. Whistle, some pumping their fists, others shouting to psych themselves up. She launched into motion without a word, her strides efficient, her posture clean. Miller bolted ahead at first, his face set in determination, but his pace faltered halfway through. Others passed him, their shouts growing ragged as fatigue ate at their lungs. She kept the same measured speed, never slowing, never straining. When the whistle blew to end the run, she crossed the line mid-pack, not first, not last, but steady. "That's all she's got," someone jeered. "No fire, no fight. Just coasting." The laughter rolled through the group like a wave. But she didn't flinch. She bent forward, resting her hands lightly on her knees, breathing through her. Nose calm as ever. To them, her lack of drama was a flaw. To her, it was discipline. During team exercises, the divide grew sharper. Obstacle courses tested not only strength, but camaraderie. The recruits shouted encouragement, pulling each other up walls, cheering at the top of their lungs. She offered no words, only her hands steady. Reliable, lifting others when needed, climbing without hesitation. But instead of gratitude, she earned smirks. "Doesn't even cheer," one recruit laughed as he slapped Miller on the back. "Where's the spirit?" "Yeah," Miller added, smirking at her as she dropped down from a wall with graceful precision. "Bet she doesn't even know how to celebrate. Too busy being invisible." The others chuckled, shaking their heads. In their world, noise equaled strength, and silence equaled absence. They couldn't comprehend the possibility that silence might be power in its own right. She didn't try to explain. Words would have been wasted. She let their smirks pass over her like wind against a mountain. But not everyone joined in. A recruit named Davis, quiet in his own way, though not as silent as her, began to notice the cracks in the other's bravado. He saw how Miller boasted about his push-up count, but collapsed during planks. He saw how the louder recruits shouted during sprints, but trailed behind when endurance truly mattered. And he saw her, always steady, always calm, never faltering. One evening, as the recruits cooled down after another brutal day, Davis sat near her on the edge of the training field. She wiped sweat from her forehead, her breathing already back to normal. "You don't let them get to you," he said quietly, his tone more observation than question. She looked at him, her expression unreadable, then gave the faintest nod. Davis smiled slightly. "Good. Don't." They smirked now, but he glanced at the others, who were laughing loudly over some shared joke. Smirks don't last forever. She didn't respond, but the corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost nothing. Then she stood and walked back toward the barracks, leaving him with the sense that her silence wasn't emptiness. It was patience. Still, the smirks continued. During weapons drills, when they carried rifles unloaded for the first time, Miller made a show of slinging his across his back like a movie hero. "Now this feels right," he announced loudly, earning laughs from those around him. She accepted her weapon quietly, cradling it with a kind of respect the others didn't notice. To her, it was not a toy, not a prop, not a chance for swagger. It was a responsibility. Miller caught sight of her steady hands and snorted. "Careful, quiet girl. Don't drop it. Looks heavier than you are." The others smirked, their laughter rippling through the group. She said nothing, adjusted the strap across her chest, and waited for instruction. The sergeant's eyes flicked toward her briefly, then back to the group. He said nothing either, but the corner of his mouth shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if he saw something the recruits did not. Smirks became the recruits' way of coping with her presence. She unsettled them without trying. She outlasted them without flaunting. She carried herself with a steadiness that made their noise feel hollow. But instead of acknowledging it, they mocked it. Instead of respecting it, they laughed. They did not realize that smirks were fragile things. They cracked under pressure. They faltered in silence. And soon, they would shatter under the weight of truth. That night in the barracks, Miller told the story again, the story he loved. To repeat, "I asked her if she knew how to talk," he said loudly, drawing chuckles from his bunkmates. "You should have seen her face. Nothing, not a word, like talking to a brick wall." The others laughed. But Davis, lying on his bunk across the room, kept his eyes on the ceiling. He said nothing, but he knew. Smirks were temporary, and one day soon, silence would break them all. The morning air carried a chill, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Clouds hung low and gray, draping the training grounds in a somber mood. Today was not just another day of push-ups or sprints. Today was range day, the moment every recruit had been waiting for, and the moment every instructor knew would separate the pretenders from the contenders. Rifles. Leave fire. Precision. The recruits lined up on the gravel, the clatter of gear mixing with nervous chatter. Some rubbed their hands together, eager, itching to prove themselves. Others wore bravado like armor, making jokes to mask the unease gnawing at their stomachs. She stood among them, quiet as always, her face unreadable. The weight of the rifle in her hands was not foreign, though none of them knew that. She held it with steady fingers, her movements deliberate, respectful, as though she were handling something sacred. Miller, of course, couldn't resist. Finally, he whispered to the recruit next to him, grinning as he adjusted his strap. "We'll see if the ghost can even pull the trigger. My money's on her freezing up." The recruit laughed under his breath, eyes flicking toward her. "Hope they've got tissues ready." Their smirks spread, little sparks of mockery jumping from face to face. The quiet girl, they thought, was about to be exposed. The drill sergeant's voice cut across the line like a blade. Listen up. This isn't a game. This isn't a movie. This is a weapon. You treat it with respect, or you'll answer to me. Understood? Yes, Sergeant. The recruits roared, though some voices cracked with nerves. The sergeant paced in front of them, his boots striking hard against the gravel. He explained the basics: stance, breath control, trigger squeeze. For many, it was overwhelming too. Many steps, too many things to think about. But for her, the words fell into place like pieces of a puzzle she already knew how to solve. She had waited for this. She had prepared for this. The first group took their positions at the firing line. Rifles up, eyes on targets. The silence that settled over the range was heavy, punctuated only by the wind. Fire! Shots cracked. Through the air, sharp and jarring. Some bullets struck wide. Others clipped the edges of the paper targets. A few recruits cursed under their breath, their nerves betraying them. The sergeant barked corrections, his voice relentless. Stop jerking the trigger. Control your breathing. You call that aim? When the first group cleared, the recruits swapped places. Her turn was coming. Miller leaned close as she stepped forward, his smirk wide. Don't choke, Ghost. Everybody's watching. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. At the line, she settled into position. The rifle rested against her shoulder, her cheek pressed to the stock. Her body shifted into alignment with the target in a way that felt natural. Practiced, the world around her faded. The whispers, the smirks, the doubts, they all dissolved into silence. All that remained was her breath, slow and steady, and the circle of the target in her sights. The sergeant's voice rang out. Fire when ready. Her finger tightened on the trigger. She exhaled. The shot cracked, ringing across the range. Dead center. The bullet punched a hole clean through the middle of the target. For a heartbeat, there was nothing, no sound, no movement. The world seemed to freeze around her. Then heads turned. Eyes widened. Even the sergeant paused, his mouth tightening into the barest hint of a nod. She lowered the rifle smoothly, reloaded, and fired again. Another shot, another bullseye. The silence deepened, heavier now. The recruits who had laughed only minutes ago stood rigid, their smirks erased, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. Miller tried to recover, his voice forced. Lucky shot, he muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. Her third shot rang. Out, shattering the excuse before it could take root. Another perfect hit, clustered tight with the others. The sergeant barked out, Next group. But his voice carried less bite than before. It was laced with something else acknowledgement. She stepped back from the line, her face unchanged, her movements calm. But inside, her pulse was steady fire. Not from nerves, but from control. From the certainty that silence had spoken louder than any boast. The rest of the day carried a different weight. During lunch, the chatter was subdued. Eyes flicked toward her from across the table, no longer mocking but wary. Whispers passed in low tones, but the laughter that usually followed was gone. She hit every shot, one recruit whispered. No way, another muttered back. Nobody's that good on their first day. I saw it, Davis said quietly from the edge of the group. She didn't miss. The others glanced at him, then back at her, sitting alone at the far end of the table. Their smirks had dissolved into something else entirely uncertainty. Later, back at the barracks, Miller tried to reignite the fire. He sat on his bunk, speaking loudly enough for all to hear. Bullseyes don't make a soldier, he said, his smirk brittle. One trick doesn't mean anything. Anybody can. Get lucky. But his words rang hollow. Even his closest allies didn't laugh this time. Their silence pressed against him, heavy, undeniable. He scowled, glaring toward her bunk. She sat quietly, polishing her rifle with the same calm precision she had shown all day. The reflection of the light caught on the metal, sharp and clear. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. Her silence had already done the talking. That night, as the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, the recruits lay awake in their bunks. The image of her first shot replayed in their minds, the sound of it, the precision, the way it cut through not just the target, but through every doubt they'd carried. For the first time, they wondered if they had been wrong. For the first time, they felt the weight of underestimation pressing back on them. And for the first time, the quiet girl's silence was no longer something to mock. It was something to fear. The air at the range was sharp and still, the kind of silence that pressed against the skin and magnified every sound. The smell of oil and gunpowder clung faintly to the air, mixing with dust kicked up by boots. Rows of paper targets fluttered. Gently at the far end, blank slates waiting to be scarred by steel and fire. She stood at the firing line, her boots planted firmly in the gravel, her rifle snug against her shoulder. Around her, the other recruits fidgeted. Some shifted from foot to foot, adjusting their grips. Others whispered nervously, trying to fill the heavy quiet with bravado. Miller couldn't resist leaning toward the recruit beside him. "She's gonna choke," he whispered, his smirk wide. "Bet she doesn't even pull the trigger." The words didn't reach her directly, but she didn't need to hear them. She could feel them, the smirks, the doubts, the eyes waiting for her to fail. The drill sergeant's voice boomed. "Ready." Rifles lifted in unison, a clumsy chorus of metal and movement. She raised hers smoothly, no hesitation in the motion. The stock rested against her shoulder, her cheek pressed gently to the wood, her eye aligned with the sights. Fire! Shots cracked through the air, a scatter of sound as bullets tore forward. Dust kicked up around the targets. Some recruits cheered at near hits, others cursed at misses. But her world narrowed. She inhaled slowly, feeling her lungs expand against the fabric of her uniform. The noise around her dimmed, fading into the background like distant thunder. Her heartbeat slowed, each thump measured, steady. She centered the sight on the bullseye. And as she exhaled, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the sound sharp, clean, final. Her bullet punched dead center, tearing through the exact middle of the target. For a moment, there was nothing. No laughter, no smirks, no chatter, only silence. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself had stopped to take notice. The recruits froze, the rifles hanging limp in their hands. A few mouths hung open, words caught in their throats. Miller's smirk faltered, crumbling as his eyes darted to her target. The perfect hole in the center mocked him more than any words could have. She didn't celebrate. She didn't glance around to see their faces. She simply adjusted her stance, reloaded with calm precision, and raised her rifle again. The second shot rang out. Another bullseye. This time, a ripple moved through the group. Heads turned. Whispers rose in disbelief. "No way." Someone muttered, "Two in a row?" Another breathed. The sergeant said nothing. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly, but there was no anger in his gaze, only acknowledgement. She fired again. Another bullseye. The silence grew heavier with each shot, pressing down on the recruits like a weight they couldn't shake. Their bravado, their smirks, their jokes, it all crumbled with every hole she punched into the center of the target. Miller's face flushed red, though whether from anger or humiliation, even he didn't know. He muttered to himself, desperate for excuses. Lucky, must be, beginner's luck. But luck didn't land 4 shots in the same circle. She fired again and again. Each shot spoke louder than any voice on that range. When her turn ended, she lowered her rifle, cleared it, and stepped back from the line. Her face was as calm as when she had stepped forward, her movements precise and unshaken. The others shifted uneasily, eyes following her as though she had suddenly become someone they couldn't quite define. The quiet girl they had mocked, dismissed, laughed at. She had just silenced them all with steel and powder. She returned to her place without a word. The range echoed not with laughter now, but with the lingering memory of her first shot. During the next round of firing, the recruits tried harder. Some gritted their teeth, pulling the trigger with newfound determination. Others grew frustrated, as their shots scattered, their hands shaking under the pressure. But no one forgot the sight of her target. Every time they lifted their rifles, they felt the weight of her example. And every time their bullets missed, they remembered the silence that followed hers. At lunch, the mess hall buzzed differently. Conversations were subdued, eyes flicking toward her between bites of food. She sat alone as always, but the air around her had shifted. She didn't miss, one recruit whispered. Every single one sent her, another confirmed. Never seen anything like it, Davis said quietly. His tone carried no mockery, only respect. Across the room, Miller stabbed at his food with unnecessary force. Doesn't mean anything, he growled to no one in particular. One good day doesn't make a soldier. But his voice lacked conviction, and the others knew it. That evening, as the recruits cleaned their rifles, the silence lingered. Usually, the room buzzed with jokes and chatter. Tonight, the atmosphere was heavy, contemplative. She sat on her bunk, cloth in hand, moving it over the metal with steady strokes. Her expression never changed. To her, nothing was different. She had simply done what she knew she could do. But to them, everything was different. Her first shot had shifted the ground beneath their feet. It had broken their doubts, shattered their smirks, and replaced them with something unfamiliar. Respect and a quiet fear. Later, as lights dimmed and the barracks settled into restless quiet, the recruits lay awake. The sound of her rifle still echoed in their minds, the sharp crack, the perfect strike, the silence that followed. It wasn't just the accuracy that haunted them. It was the way she had done it. No words, no celebration, no gloating. Just silence. For the first time since training began, the recruits didn't whisper about her. They didn't joke, didn't smirk. They lay in silence, their thoughts heavy with the truth they could no longer ignore. The quiet girl had spoken at last, and her voice had been a bullet. The days after the first shot unfolded like ripples in a pond, spreading further than anyone had expected. Training moved forward, schedules remained the same, and drills kept their rhythm, but something in the air had changed. The recruits felt it each morning when they woke, each time they stood in formation, each moment their eyes flicked toward the quiet girl. Where there had once been smirks and jokes, now there was silence. Not her silence, theirs. She carried herself the same as always, steady, calm, with no interest in chatter or attention. She cleaned her rifle meticulously, kept her bunk neat, executed drills with precision. To her, nothing had changed. She had simply done what she had trained herself to do. But for the others, her presence had shifted. Whispers at dawn, on the third morning after the range day, as the recruits laced their boots and tugged at their uniforms, Davis leaned toward the man beside him and spoke. Low. She's different, he muttered, tying his laces tighter. The man nodded slowly. Not what I thought? Across the barracks, Miller overheard. His jaw clenched. Different? He scoffed, his voice just loud enough to carry. She got lucky. Anybody can string a few shots together. Davis frowned. You saw it. That wasn't luck. The words hung in the air, bold and dangerous. A week ago, no one would have dared defend her. A week ago, Miller's opinion would have carried weight. Now it sounded hollow. The quiet girl slid her boots on without glancing at them, the conversation rolling past her like water against stone. But deep down, she felt the shift, subtle, as a breeze changing direction. On the field, physical training that morning was grueling. The recruits jogged under the weight of their packs, sweat slicking their faces, breaths ragged. She ran in silence, her pace even and measured. She didn't surge to the front, didn't fall behind. Her rhythm never faltered. One step after, another, steady as her heartbeat. Recruits who once laughed at her silence now found themselves falling into her rhythm. Without realizing, they matched her pace, their feet striking the ground in unison with hers. It steadied them, anchored them. Miller noticed it, his frustration bubbling. He pushed harder, running ahead, shouting over his shoulder, "Keep up, slowpokes." But when he looked back, he saw their eyes not on him, but drifting toward her, the quiet figure at the center of their rhythm. It stung more than the ache in his legs. Breaking old patterns at meals, the change was more obvious. Where once laughter rose at her expense, now the mess hall carried a different energy. The recruits sat in clusters, but their voices dropped whenever she entered. Some glanced up at her with a flicker of curiosity. A few even shifted, as though debating whether to invite her over. None dared yet, but the absence of mockery was telling enough. She sat alone as always, eating methodically. She neither sought their approval, nor avoided their stares. She simply existed in her quiet way. But for them, the silence was no longer comfortable. It was humbling. A test of authority, the instructors noticed too. The drill sergeant, a man hardened by years of training recruits, had observed the shift with interest. On the obstacle course one afternoon, he stopped the group midway through a grueling climb. "You," he barked, pointing at her. She stepped forward without hesitation, eyes steady. "Demonstrate." The recruits held their breath. She approached. The rope wall grasped it firmly and began her ascent. Her movements were fluid, deliberate. She didn't rush, didn't stumble, didn't falter. At the top, she swung herself over smoothly, then descended with the same calm control. The sergeant gave a curt nod. Textbook. His voice carried no praise. He wasn't a man who gave compliments. But his choice to use her as the example spoke volumes. The recruits exchanged glances. Miller scowled. The shift was undeniable. Cracks in Miller's armor that evening, Miller cornered Davis near the water station. His voice was low, but tight with frustration. "You're buying into this crap?" he demanded. "She's not special. She's just quiet. It's a trick. Man, don't fall for it." Davis met his glare evenly. "It's not a trick if she's good." Miller's jaw tightened. He wanted to lash out, to reassert himself. But the confidence that once fueled him was slipping, crumbling beneath the weight of her silence. For the first time, Miller realized he wasn't the center of the group anymore. And he hated it. The quiet confidence, meanwhile, she carried on. Unchanged. She rose early, kept to herself, and performed every task with precision. But where once her silence made her invisible, now it made her magnetic. Recruits found themselves watching her, studying the way she tied her gear, the way she cleaned her rifle, the way she breathed before a drill. Some began mimicking her methods quietly, hoping to absorb some of her control. She never noticed, or perhaps she did, but chose not to acknowledge it. Her focus was inward, on discipline, on mastery, not on the shifting tides of opinion around her. And yet, her very indifference gave her power. A moment of acknowledgement. Late one evening, as the recruits sat polishing their rifles, Davis glanced across the barracks. The quiet girl worked in silence, her motions methodical, her eyes focused. He cleared his throat. "Hey," he said, voice hesitant. "Good shooting the other day?" The room stilled. All eyes shifted toward him. She looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. Then she gave the faintest nod before returning to her task. It was nothing, merely a gesture. But in that moment, Davis felt it the acknowledgement of a soldier who didn't waste words. The others watched, processing what they had just seen. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't camaraderie. But it was something new. Respect. The night watch during a late night. Fire watch. One recruit sat beside her at the edge of the training grounds. The stars stretched endlessly above. The night quiet, except for the occasional rustle of wind. After several minutes of silence, he spoke softly. "You don't talk much." She didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, finally, she said, "Talking doesn't make the shot land." The recruit absorbed the words, simple yet sharp. He nodded slowly, realizing he'd been given more than an answer. He'd been given a philosophy. And when word of that brief exchange spread, it deepened the shift. The quiet girl's silence wasn't emptiness. It was discipline. The turning point. By the end of the week, the recruits had changed. Their jokes had faded. Their whispers had turned into caution. Their smirks had been replaced by curiosity, and in some, admiration. Miller still tried, still spat his bitterness into the air, but it carried no weight. The others no longer laughed with him. They no longer looked to him. The shift was complete. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't fought for it. She hadn't spoken a single word to claim it. But the moment she pulled that first trigger, the balance had tipped. And now, her silence filled the space where their laughter once lived. The shift had begun with her first shot, but it wasn't until the days that followed that the recruits truly began to understand what it meant. Respect didn't bloom overnight, nor did it come easily in a world built on sweat, grit, and relentless challenge. But little by little, the quiet girl, once the object of ridicule, was becoming something else entirely. The weight of silence had started in the smallest of ways. During morning drills, the recruits who once jostled to stand far from her now found themselves stealing glances in her direction. Some mirrored her rhythm during push-ups, finding her steady pace easier to follow than their own erratic bursts. On runs, they noticed how she conserved her energy, how she never sprinted recklessly at the start, but finished with strength left in her stride. Without words, she taught them endurance, patience, and focus. Her silence was no longer awkward. It was instructive. The marksmanship test, the second official marksmanship test loomed, and tension filled the air. Recruits whispered nervously as they cleaned their rifles, the memory of her flawless performance fresh in their minds. "She aced it again," Davis murmured, his tone carrying certainty rather than disbelief. "She doesn't even look nervous," another recruit said, watching her work silently at her bunk. Miller scoffed, but his voice cracked. "She'll choke eventually. Nobody's perfect." The day of the test arrived. The recruits stood at the line, rifles ready. One by one, they fired. Some improved, some faltered. The air buzzed with nerves. When her turn came, the silence was immediate, almost reverent. She stepped forward, calm and unshaken. Her shots rang out, each one precise, each one true. Not all were perfect bullseyes, but her grouping was tighter than anyone else's. Consistency, that was her weapon. A sergeant walked down the line. Of targets, his boots crunching on gravel. He stopped at hers, studying the clustered holes. His face was unreadable, but when he turned, he barked. "That's what I expect from all of you. Discipline, control, consistency." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. The recruits knew who had set the standard. The first request. Later that evening, Davis approached her cautiously. She sat at her bunk, field stripping her rifle with smooth efficiency. "Hey," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Can you show me how you breathe? Before you shoot, I mean." "I keep pulling to the left." She glanced at him, her eyes steady. For a moment, he thought she might ignore him. But then, she placed her rifle on the bunk and said simply, "Sit." He obeyed, watching as she demonstrated the rhythm. Inhale, exhale, pause, squeeze. No lecture, no flourish, just precision. Davis tried it, mimicking her. His first attempt was clumsy, but she didn't scold. She just adjusted his grip with a slight nudge of her hand. When he looked up at her, there was something new in his gaze. Not curiosity. Not awe. Respect. A ripple through the ranks word spread quickly. Soon, others approached her, not loudly, not publicly, but in quiet moments when pride didn't weigh so heavily. "Can you check my stance? Do you ever get nervous before a shot? How do you run without losing your breath?" She answered each question with the same calm efficiency, never wasting words. Sometimes she demonstrated. Sometimes she simply nodded or shook her head. And always, her silence carried weight. The recruits began to rely on her, not because she demanded it, but because her presence demanded it without trying. The crumbling of Miller for Miller, the change was unbearable. He had built his identity on being the loudest, the boldest, the one others looked to. But now his words fell flat. His smirks no longer sparked laughter. His boasts were drowned out by the memory of her steady shots. One afternoon, during a grueling endurance drill, Miller stumbled. His pride kept him from asking for help, but his legs betrayed him. He faltered, nearly dropping his pack. To his shock, it was the quiet girl who steadied him. She didn't say a word, just a firm hand on his arm, keeping him upright before moving on. For Miller, the humiliation was sharp. But for the others, it was something else. Proof that even in silence, she embodied strength that wasn't selfish. Respect earned, not given. The instructors noticed the shift too. During one particularly difficult navigation exercise, the recruits grew restless, arguing over which direction to take. Voices rose, confusion mounting. She crouched down, studied the map, then pointed silently toward a ridge. The group hesitated. Miller sneered. "What makes you think she knows better?" But Davis spoke up firmly. "Because she's been right. Every damn time." The group followed her lead. Hours later, when they arrived at the correct checkpoint, exhaustion gave way to relief. Eyes turned toward her with unspoken gratitude. Respect wasn't just growing, it was solidifying. A subtle change in the barracks at night. The tone was different now. Where once the quiet girl's presence was ignored, now it anchored the room. Conversations hushed when she polished her rifle. Jokes softened when she lay in her bunk. Even the recruits, who had never spoken to her, began to measure themselves against her. Could they run as steady? Could they shoot as precise? Could they carry themselves with that same quiet discipline? She hadn't sought followers, but she had them all the same. The conversation that changed everything one evening, after lights out, Davis whispered across the dark barracks. "You know, you could lead us. The guys listen to you." She didn't respond immediately. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of the night. Finally, her voice came, quiet but certain. "I don't need to lead. I need to be ready." The words sank deep into Davis's mind and into the ears of those still awake. It wasn't ambition that drove her. It was discipline. And that, they realized, was why she commanded respect more than anyone else. The unspoken shift by the week's end, a transformation, was undeniable. Where she had once been the quiet girl, dismissed and mocked, she was now the silent standard, the one every recruit measured themselves against, whether they admitted it or not. Miller still tried to fight it, but his defiance only highlighted the truth. The group no longer revolved around him. It revolved around her, not because she demanded it, not because she wanted it, but because she had earned it with every shot, with every step, with every moment of silence. The recruits no longer smirked when she walked into the room. They straightened, because respect had replaced ridicule, and her silence had become louder than any words they could have spoken. The final weeks of training pressed down on the recruits with unrelenting force. Fatigue weighed heavy in their bones, and the sharp edge of the instructors' voices cut deeper as the finish line drew near. Every day was a test of strength, of discipline, of will. And through it all, the quiet girl remained unchanged. Her movements were steady, her focus unwavering. She ran the drills, carried the loads, climbed the walls, and fired the shots with the same calm precision as always. She did not chase recognition. She did not seek approval. But recognition came anyway, carried in the stolen glances of her peers, the subtle nods of instructors, and the hush that fell whenever she stepped to the line. The final range day, the last marksmanship assessment, arrived on a clear morning. The sky stretched wide and endless, the sun casting long shadows across the range. The recruits lined up, rifles in hand, nerves humming beneath their skin. This test would be recorded, scored, and remembered. She took her place at the line, her face composed, her hands steady. The others stole glances at her, some in awe, some in quiet determination to measure themselves against her one last time. The sergeant's command cracked through the air. Fire! Shots rang out, echoing across the field. Dust rose in small clouds as bullets struck wide, clipped edges, or pierced through. Her shots, as always, were steady. Not every bullet struck dead center, but her grouping was tighter than anyone else's. Where others wavered, hers held the line. Where others faltered, hers remained constant. When the sergeant inspected the targets, his voice carried no softness. No praise, just fact. Consistent, controlled, that's the standard. And once again, everyone knew whose work defined that word. Graduation approaches. As training neared its end, talk of graduation filled the air. Recruits whispered about their families, their futures, their assignments. Some spoke with excitement, others with nervous uncertainty. But when her name came up in those conversations, it was always with the same tone, quiet, reverent. She be the best shot in whatever unit she goes to. Wouldn't want to be on the other side of her rifle. She's the real deal. Miller never joined those conversations anymore. He had grown quieter himself, his confidence chipped away until only fragments remained. He no longer mocked her, no longer challenged her. He avoided her gaze, perhaps fearing the reflection he'd see there of everything he pretended to be and everything she truly was. The quiet shift in leadership. During one of the last field exercises, the recruits were tasked with moving as a unit across rugged terrain. Arguments flared almost immediately. Who should take point, which path to choose, how to time their movements. Voices clashed, frustration mounting. She stood silently, observing. Then, without a word, she adjusted her gear, stepped forward, and began moving toward the ridge. For a moment, no one followed. Then Davis shrugged, muttering, "She's never been wrong yet." One by one, the recruits fell in behind her. The exercise ran smoother than any before it. They reached the checkpoint faster, quieter, more efficiently. Not because she commanded them, but because they trusted her. The instructors saw it. The recruits felt it. She had never sought leadership, but it had found her all the same. The last night in the barracks on the eve of graduation, the barracks buzzed with an energy unlike any before. Recruits packed their gear, swapped stories, and joked about who had stumbled the worst or sweated the most. In the corner, she polished her rifle one last time, the ritual steady and unbroken. Davis approached, his voice softer than usual. "You know," he said, You changed this place." She glanced up, her expression unreadable. "No one says it," he continued, "but we all know it. You shut us up without saying a word. Made us better without even trying. I respect that." For the first time, something flickered across her face. Not a smile exactly, but a small curve at the corner of her lips. A gesture so rare, it might as well have been gold. Then she returned to her task, silent as always. Graduation. Day the sun was high, the air heavy with anticipation. The recruits stood in formation, their uniforms sharp, their boots polished mirrors. Family members filled the stands, their cheers carrying across the field. The commanding officer spoke, his words formal, rehearsed, heavy with tradition. He praised discipline, endurance, and the bonds forged in hardship. But as he handed out commendations, eyes in the crowd drifted, following whispers among the recruits themselves. They weren't watching Miller, or Davis, or any of the louder voices. They were watching her, the quiet girl who had silenced the range, who had shifted the course of their training, who had become the standard by which they measured themselves. She stood at attention, her gaze forward, her silence unbroken. She neither sought the spotlight nor shied from it. She was simply there, steady, disciplined, unshaken. The legacy among them after the ceremony, as families embraced and recruits laughed in relief, Davis caught sight of her across the field. She was alone, her posture calm, her eyes scanning the horizon as though the next challenge already awaited her. He turned to the others nearby. "We'll tell this story one day," he said quietly, "about the quiet girl, the one we doubted, the one who shut us up with her first shot." The recruits nodded, each carrying the memory. It wasn't just her skill they would remember. It was her silence, her discipline, her refusal to bend to mockery or pressure. Her legacy wasn't written in words. It was etched in the silence she had commanded, the respect she had earned, and the standard she had set. The final image as the recruits dispersed, heading toward their families and futures. She lingered a moment longer on the field. The wind tugged at her uniform, carrying with it the echoes of shots fired, of laughter silenced, of respect earned. She shouldered her pack, her rifle at her side, and walked away without a word. No farewell speeches, no declarations, just silence. The same silence that had spoken louder than any voice, that had turned smirks into awe, that had transformed doubt into respect. And long after the range had quieted, long after the barracks stood empty, the story remained. The recruits would tell it again and again, how they smirked at the quiet girl, how her first shot silenced them, and how her silence never stopped speaking.